Welcome to the Online for Authors podcast. I'm the founder, Jennifer Palmer. Today I'm pleased to welcome Teri M Brown as our guest host. Teri is an author herself and is considering if a podcast of her own is a fit for her. Until then, we're happy to have her with us. Teri's guest is a second-generation Holocaust survivor, retired corporate communicator, and a memoir writer. A memoir that represents 5 years of intense research in the U.S., Poland, Sweden, Israel, and Germany. The author sought to unearth and understand the real-life stories of his parents. A memoir that takes Honor Thy Parents to a whole new level. Max J. Friedman says, I discovered just how much life often interferes with our dreams.
I would like to welcome Max J. Friedman, the author of Painful Joy, a Holocaust family memoir. Welcome, Max.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
I am so glad to have you. This book has a lot to it.
Basically, the book is, as it's entitled, a family Holocaust memoir. And what that really means is that my parents were Holocaust survivors. They met after the war, after their liberation from concentration camps. My sister and I were born in Sweden, where they were recuperating from their traumas, which they never really managed to recuperate from fully. This book sort of chronicles their lives from the time they were born, because essentially I had avoided that entire story because being the child of Holocaust survivors essentially makes you have to try to survive their survival. And I think by doing that, I tried to do that by avoiding it. And until I was 66 years old, and that was even a while ago. I didn't go back. I didn't find out. And they were gone, and I spent 5 years trying to find out who they were, who they might have become, and what traumas might have been passed on to their children and even future generations beyond them.
You know, I'm widely read. I love to read. I have read quite a few accounts of people that have survived or not survived in the Holocaust. This one was different in a lot of ways, and I think it's because it came from your point of view as opposed to theirs. And it really went back much further than when the war started.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of times I think people focus, starting in the mid 30s and forward. And you took us all the way back to when they were born, and we got to meet who they were beforehand. Your grandson asked you a question that got you started kind of writing this memoir. So tell us, what was that question, and why was it important for you to find the answer for him?
He was 8 years old. We'd been very close. And he was having some issues, I guess, with his life, even at 8. Not necessarily saying welcome to my world, but so I started to talk to him about my mother. My mother was most obviously affected by what happened to her as a survivor. And I tried to explain to him that people can have difficult lives and still do okay. And then so he asked me this question, and he said, so if they were survivors, and he never knew them, then you were a survivor in some way. And then maybe one day I will be a survivor. Is that true? Is that possible? Because he wanted to have the strength of a survivor. And I said, I have no idea. And I said, I'm going to try to find out. And it took 5 years to try to begin to find out. And I went early in their lives to the beginning, because I didn't know anything about the beginning of their lives, because I wanted to see what could I learn about their early lives that maybe helped them survive or something. And I didn't know what I was even looking for.
If your grandson were to ask you that question today, what's your answer for him now?
Well, my answer for him now is that I understood much more about myself as a result. And I understood things about me that I got from my parents, good things, because I got some really bad things too, that have helped me survive. And probably the most important thing that I learned from them is to never, never, never give up. They never gave up, despite the most horrible things that could happen to a human being.
So what does your grandson and other family members think of this memoir?
When I did it, initially I did it just for my family, which is a small family, my sister and myself and our children, grandchildren. And then I decided, for a number of reasons, that it was a story that perhaps was important to tell to other people as well. So I sent the manuscript. I shared it obviously with my wife, who was instrumental in helping me on a lot of the research, she's a librarian. My two sons had seen it, and I gave it to my grandson. And I asked him what he thought. And he said that it was a tough read, he said. And this was several years later. But he said, but I'm tough now. Yeah, that's sort of what happened. And that was his reaction.
His reaction. What about your sister? How does she feel about everything that you found?
My sister, it was a more complicated thing, because my sister was more touched than I was by my parents' traumas. She was older. We came to the United States in 1952 and from Sweden. And my sister's relationship, as many daughters' relationships with mothers, was fraught. And fraught is an understatement. And the issue for my sister was essentially that my mother, who, as I learned over the years of research, had never really had a childhood, and in a sense was a survivor and a refugee her entire life. And so what she did to survive was to create a fantasy life for herself. She decided, became apparent, that my sister was going to be the vessel for that fantasy life. My sister could not be who she wanted to be, and she was sort of a bookish, very smart, wanting to just study and learn and read. And my mother wanted her to be this social, outgoing person who could attract boys and all this other stuff, all things that actually my mother never did. Or ever had the opportunity to do, for lots of reasons. My sister was very happy that I had done it, but when I sent the manuscript to her, I basically said to her, I know it's bringing back memories, because she had essentially erased her memories of her childhood. And I said, and if this really hurts you, we're going to burn the book, and that'll be it. And it'll never see the light of day. And then she read it and she said, no, this is going to help me heal. And that's what happened.
Well, good. I did notice that in the book you were talking about your parents and their roles in your life, and kind of like where you played out. And it sounds like you kind of got to skirt along the edges a little bit, like come and go a little more and be a little less in the limelight of your mother's angst. And then your father didn't portray what he did in the same way that your mother did. Right. He was more quiet and internal and focused more on his religion and bringing the children up and working. And that's kind of how he managed. What you got from your dad was very different from what your sister.
Right. I was very lucky. My father was a sweet man, and again, those who read Painful Joy will see, he had never spoke about anything related to his past, and I think he so cherished the idea of being able to have another family, because he had lost his wife, his first wife, and his two little children at Auschwitz, that this was the most marvelous thing that could happen to him. And he found religion, because I think he had lost it, and he found his religion. And I was able to skirt it because perhaps because I had become a survivor at a very young age, I knew that this was an extremely abnormal world that I lived in. And I was going to escape it in any way I could. And as people who read the book, you could see, starting at age 7, I left my house. I would go on the subway by myself from Coney Island in Brooklyn and into the city and make believe I was an adult, and ride elevators and wear a little bow tie and think that I was an adult, and do everything I could possibly do to not be home. And I did that. I went to college. I went to Columbia. I could take the subway to Columbia, but I didn't want to. I wanted to leave my house and I wanted to live there. And we didn't have any money. And luckily, I had a scholarship, so we could afford. And my father asked me one day, because he knew that there was a kid who lived down the block who also went to Columbia, and he would go on the subway every day back and forth. And he said, why don't you go on the subway the way Stanley goes on the subway? And I said, it's not good for my education. And education was very important to him. He only went to school for 6 years in his life, till sixth grade, and then he had to support his family because his father had died at an early age. And he said, "Oh, okay, okay," and that was it. And
That was it.
and I was very lucky. My sister was not as fortunate.
When I read that about your mom and your sister, I don't think that it is just because of the Holocaust. Although that was a lot, I think there are a lot of moms who try to live their lives through their daughters, especially if they look back on their own childhood or teenagehood and wish maybe they had been different or been given different opportunities. And they see these opportunities and then they kind of, like shove them at their daughters who are going, oh, but that's so not me. It's not what I want. And then you add the layer on of everything that your mother had been through, and it became even a bigger need for your mother to have your sister be this person that she believed she could have been had the war not happened, had the Holocaust not happened, had she not been a refugee her whole life.
Right, exactly. As anyone who reads the book again would find out, my mother made up stories. And she made up stories not only around the camps, although many of those stories around the camps turned out were actually true, but about her life before the camps. The most important story that she told us was that she and her first husband ran this dance studio.
Right.
And we believed her. And I remember coming back from our visits to Poland and calling my sister and I saying, there is no dance studio. There never was a dance studio. And my wife and I actually thought we found the dance studio, just around the corner from where they lived and all this other stuff. And we had believed. And she said, no, I can't believe that. And her husband made luggage. He had no dance studio. They didn't make money. They barely had enough money to eat. And my mother took in wash in order to actually survive during the early part of the war. And then there were the camps. And then
right. I think the memory of the dance studio was what she had hoped that they would have. Like this was a dream that was never realized.
Right.
And it was something to hang on to. It was, and you think about something long enough and you put that dream quality into it long enough and it does start to feel very real.
Right.
You can imagine what you had done. I love in the very end of your mom's life how she was teaching some dance. I can't remember, was it at a
senior center,
at a senior center
in Brooklyn. Right.
That made me so happy. I just grinned from ear to ear because I thought, she didn't get to do it in that early life, but at least in a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. She realized that dream, and I loved that. I loved that part.
The most noble part of her life. I mean, I'm just making this up because I don't know what anything really in terms of the reality of her life and what that could have been like. But the last years of her life, I write about the last walk we took together.
Right.
And it was a short time, she was taking care of my father who had Alzheimer's. So he was a person who didn't want to remember anything about his past. And ironically, he got Alzheimer's. Right. And my mother, the parts about her past she either made up or were horrible. Because she would talk about concentration camps when we were kids. That was our bedtime stories. And at the end, she was the best that she had ever been with my father. Because I never saw love really. And as I say in the book, the best thing that I found out about the book is that they once loved each other when they first met. And I found a love letter. And that's how the book starts, with a love letter. And it ends with love. And Painful Joy, the title comes from a poem written by a Jewish sage in the Middle Ages, which talks about what is love like when it's touched by death? How different does love become? And then as soon as I saw that, I said, this has to be the book, because the love was there, was love that was a very different kind of love. And then at the end, it was an all consuming kind of love in a way, and her coming to terms with herself in a way that she hadn't for the 80 years before. It's an opportunity, I think, for readers to meet two strangers who are very ordinary in many ways, poor Polish Jews, and come to know them and come to understand them and come to see how people can surmount some things and other things are insurmountable.
Exactly. As I was reading the book, I was struck by an immense amount of love that you have for your parents. I mean, it came through even when you were talking about some very difficult things with your mother or difficult situations that you found yourself in due to all the things that happened to them and then how that manifested itself in your home growing up. I just was struck by that love that just kept coming through instead of something like resentment. And I'm just curious, how do you think you managed to come to a place where you could look back on what is arguably a very difficult childhood, very difficult, and yet you came out of it with this great love as opposed to a resentment and this idea of, well, my parents caused it all. And, the thing that's kind of prevalent today where we point fingers and cast blame, you seem to come out of it in a different place.
Yeah, I think because both my sister and I, and my sister even more because she was a few years older than me, I think we also, besides developing a lot of fears and other things that are pretty negative from the traumas that we saw around us, we also developed a deep empathy for these two people. And we never forgot what they went through, even though we didn't even understand it at the beginning. But we just knew that these were people that had gone through too much. And my sister as well. I mean, she forgave my mother. My mother was not nice to my sister in the least, even in the later years. And my sister took great care of her. We forgave them everything because we understood that these people, that we couldn't have done what these people did. I don't think I could have done that. And so empathy, and I think as I came to understand the book and why maybe it would be good for people to read, I want people to walk away with a greater sense of empathy about strangers, about people who you look at and you say, I don't want to be anywhere near these people, but they have stories, they have feelings, they have things that happen to them, and it happens to all of us, and we should not look at people as either non-entities, the way the Germans took away their names, took away their identity, took away their humanity, and gave them numbers, and that's who they were. And Joseph Mengele, when he was asked once, how could you send people to the left where they were being sent to the gas chambers? And he said they were already ghosts. These people weren't people. I didn't see them as people. I saw them, they were already dead. And I think in our current world, there's a lot of talk about a lot of things that upset us and that we think a lot of people are crazy and are going in the wrong direction, and that may all actually be true. But at the same time, they are people and they all have their stories, and we can't forget that. And once we make them enemies and we make them subhuman and don't identify them as people anymore, then it's sort of over.
I agree. I had a hard time reading the book. I loved it, but I would read it and then I would have to put it away. It would be like I had intended, usually at night, I read about 50 pages. And that's what I do. And then I get through, a book a week kind of thing by reading 50 pages at night. And I can honestly say 10 or 15 pages was about the max of what I could do, because the emotional turmoil that it was bringing up was pretty intense, but it was so worth reading, and the things that I learned and the feelings that I had and the understanding. I don't think there are too many books out here like this one that come from the perspective of, a child saying, this is what happened to my parents. And not only what happened to my parents during the war, which we do hear a lot of. But what happened to my parents for the next, 50 years?
50 years, right.
50 years.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have this idea that like once a war is over or once a big, ugly event is past, that it's actually over. And it's really not for anyone who lived it.
Yeah.
It's something that they live with for the rest of their lives. And as you said, actually pass it on to the next generations.
Yeah. And I think, when we're watching the horrors that are going on in Ukraine and all these places, my mother grew up 3 miles away from the border with Ukraine and Poland. You have to say that this is not going to go away for these millions of people. It's not going to go away, and it's going to have an effect on them and an effect on their interactions with the world as well. In a way, there weren't that many survivors of the camps. So and they're pretty much all gone except for the ones who were hidden children and things like that. But it leaves behind always, and the point of the book is half about them and their individual journeys, and the other half is about them and us. And the them and us is the only part that I could attest to.
Everything else was kind of speculation. It appears that based on the records I found,
it differs, I think, with some books because of that, and because of the fact that some people knew more. Some people managed to ask their parents, and the parents were actually willing to talk about it, but many of the survivors did not want to talk about it, and they married other survivors because those people could understand them. Could understand them in a way that no one else could ever understand them. And then a lot of them moved on, and it looked like they moved on in an external sense, but you can't possibly move on. You have to just be. You have to continue to survive, and everybody does it in a different way.
You stated when that you were doing this research that you started having like night sweats and night terrors and etc. Help us kind of understand what you found that led to these emotions. Like, it sounds to me like you started experiencing some of what your parents had experienced pretty much throughout their whole life. I just would like to know more.
It came as a surprise because I really accepted who they were. And I had put a distance between myself and their experiences in some ways in order to move on. And so I thought this book was going to be a discovery, an intellectual sort of experience. I wanted to know what happened to them, where they were born, because where they told me they were born was not where they were born. When they were born was not when they were born. None of that. Their siblings and all that stuff. Everything was different. But when the night sweats started, and I went to my doctor and I said, this is all this. And I asked, I said, well, it occurred to me as I'm talking to her that maybe this has something to do with what I'm doing. And she said, no. And we went through many, many scans because everybody, the doctors all thought that I had some sort of blood cancer, essentially, because the night sweats are typical for that. No one found anything. And finally, they just sort of said, well, who knows? But then it became clear that I knew. And when I did, it was weird. Because this was after we had already come back from our trip. And during the trip, it was quite emotional because it was during the trip that we went to Auschwitz. And that's where my father's first wife and children were murdered. And they tell you that when you walk the grounds of Auschwitz, that in fact you're walking on the ashes of all the people, or many of the over a million people who were burned, whose bodies were burned. And there was no place to put the ashes, so they put it in the ground. And you're walking on that. And then every little thing suddenly became a drama in and of itself. And it still has taken me some time because I've been spending this last number of months talking about it again and sort of reliving some of the emotions that I felt. I mean, when I first heard the names of my father's children, 2 little girls, 1.5 and 4 years old, Ada and Fagla, I suddenly found out that there were these 2 people, and they had names and they had birth dates, and I found what they were, and I knew the day that they were murdered. And even as I talk about it now, it's difficult. But then, you just start crying. And I generally don't cry. But I also generally like only happy endings. And in a sense, my sister and I are the happy ending
Right.
and our children and grandchildren are the happy ending. But we came to appreciate, or I came to appreciate more, and my sister as well, I think the happy ending that they had because they had us. And if they hadn't had us, I don't think they could have survived.
Which is so amazing that you look at when they found one another.
Mhm.
They were both still very, very ill.
Right.
They were no, I mean, I know you say they never got completely well, but at the point that they met, they were still very ill. Yet they met and they fell in love. I was quite frankly stunned that your mother was even able to get pregnant, given the horrific conditions that she was in. And I know how hard it is for women who are malnourished and other things, and to know all that she went through, the fact that she was able to actually carry a baby to term was just unbelievable to me. And I did think what an amazing blessing that was for them to kind of find hope in a world that seemed rather hopeless.
Right. And people always talk about how parents like to sort of live through their children, as we were just talking
Yeah.
about my mother and my sister. But in a sense that this was their only way to make it. And I think they needed each other. In another world, they would have met and would have actually probably ignored each other at best. This was a different world, and
Right.
and coming to terms with a different world was basically the way my sister and I had to grow up and had to understand. And I think that again had its good points and its bad points.
Obviously, you found some difficult things when you were doing all this research. What would you say was the most difficult thing?
The most difficult thing was finding out when my father's children and wife died, because my father's story about that was not actually quite
Quite
true.
accurate. Right.
Yeah, and the fact that he told me that story was difficult at first to take, because it's the only time we ever talked about his life before the war. The turning point for me was we had gone to where my mother had lived in Krakow. Krakow's the beautiful, beautiful city. Jennifer, my wife, and I go there, and I'm looking up the address that we're going to, because I wanted to go to every place where my parents had lived and I have an address for, just to see what it's like and maybe learn something from it. And so we go, and I'm looking, and it was Josepha 12. That was the address. And I go to Google to just see where on the map it is, so we don't get lost when we go there. And there's this whole story about Steven Spielberg.
Right.
And Steven Spielberg basically uses the tenement that my mother lived in for 25 years with her first husband and with her mother and father and some of her siblings as the central location for the Krakow ghetto in Schindler's List. And this was quite amazing, but it wasn't upsetting. It was delightful in a certain way, because it allowed me to think that my mother would have so loved to be at the center, because basically it became a sightseeing, a place where tours went. And so my wife and I go to this place, and we're standing in the courtyard, and anybody who looks up Josepha 12 will see the courtyard, or anyone who's seen Schindler's List will see the courtyard, because that's where she lived. And we go there, and a tour is going by, and this woman is talking about this building in a very sort of distant way. Why shouldn't she? To a bunch of Italian tourists. And I walk over, and it's the first time that I actually connected with my past in any public way. My wife and I and my sister and I, we obviously knew a lot about our feelings about it and what my parents were like. But I walked over to them. First time I walked over, and I said, "Excuse me, but my mother lived here. And her family lived here. Except for my mother, they were all murdered right down the road." And And it was very difficult for me to get those words out.
I can imagine.
Then everything about her life and their lives became much more real
Real.
than they could have been otherwise by me looking up another date and another. I mean, this was where all kinds of good things and very bad things happened, and where it would start and where it would end. And that was very difficult. The Auschwitz was very difficult.
Yeah.
And I would call my sister every time I found out anything, because I found out dozens and dozens of surprising things. And I would call her. And my sister's reaction was always, "Oh, it's so great you're doing this." And she didn't want to know more. I mean, it was sort of like she had had enough her whole life. She didn't
Right.
want to know more.
She didn't need more at the moment. Yeah.
Her hard drive had been erased.
Right.
And that was it. It's only after the book and after I started to talk about it and send her like my podcast things or an article or this or that she come to sort of say, And it's interesting because I'm actually going to go to Mobile, Alabama, where my parents spent their last years, and talk to a group of high school and college kids about these two people. And it's another way for me to sort of create a kind of memorial in my own head, and my sister still lives in Mobile, to sort of honor people who many people would look at and just say, I don't know if I really want to even get near these people. And that unfortunately was true when we were young. And, one dose of my mother for most strangers was more than enough.
Right.
Right. You didn't want to take that medicine again if you didn't have to. We had to. But other people didn't. And so people didn't come back. I mean, and these were all survivors as well, but they were survivors who somehow
they did it differently.
They did it differently. They did it very differently.
But one of the things that's interesting is that despite doing it differently and despite doing it in a way that was difficult for others, she still did it.
Oh, she did it day in and day out.
But she did it.
Oh yeah, she did it.
She made it all the way through to the end, and she brought you and your sister into the world. And yes, you have some things that you've had to learn how to deal with, but you also got some really amazing things from them as well. And as I was reading the book, I went back and forth between like really admiring her and really wanting to say, what is get a grip. And then I would think that and think, well, this is her grip.
Yeah, this is her grip. And in a very real sense, it's her grip. If you ever met her, she would latch onto you. She would take your arm and she would say, pay attention to me.
Right.
I'm talking to you and I'm telling you something, and I need you to hear me. And again, she was this tiny, tiny little lady, and she had a grip that could kill. I don't know what it could do.
It could do a lot of things.
It could do a lot of things, but it forced people. And even when she moved to Mobile, I mean, she's, this little lady, this little Jewish lady from Brooklyn.
Living in Mobile, Alabama, of all places, right?
Yeah, right? And luckily in the South, everybody's very, whatever they feel, they're very
polite on the outside. Yeah.
Right. So, no one ever said bad things to her, but she stopped people on the street and start telling them about her story about Bergen-Belsen and being starved there. And people they didn't have a choice at a certain point. So they listened, and the mailman listened. The college kid next door in the garden apartment next door listened. I was so delighted that I found some people who were willing to allow me to talk in Mobile about the book and about them, that I could find that, because they're buried in Mobile, Alabama, these two people. Strangers in a strange land, they were always strangers in a strange land.
Yeah.
And the fact that they managed to get that and managed to have two children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren is testament to the human spirit.
It really is. It really is. You said something that struck me, that it was while that you were there in Poland that things became real to you. I think what struck me about that is I would have thought that it had always been like unbelievably real to you. And yet even you had to kind of come to terms with how real was. As someone who has no anything with the Holocaust, it didn't touch my life personally in any real way. And I had gone to the Holocaust Museum in DC. And as we were walking through, it's very enlightening. I was learning things. I would have said that I had a complete understanding of what had happened. And we walked into this hall, and it was full of a photographer's photos. And these photos had been of a town that was a completely Jewish town that was completely wiped away. Nearly everyone died, or everyone, I can't remember now the numbers. And I stood there and looked at these photos, and they were photos of people having birthday parties and photos of people swinging on the swings and getting into their normal, everyday life. All of a sudden, I was overwhelmed with the idea that this was not about a Jewish people, but this was about individuals, and that it could have been me, that I had birthday parties, and that I got into my car, and that I didn't end up going through the rest of the museum. At that point, I had exactly what I could handle and left. I mean, I couldn't get out of there fast enough just because of the overwhelming understanding that hit me. And so I figured it was just because of my age and that I didn't have any relatives. But then to hear you say that you also kind of went through your own reckoning of it becoming real, I think that we all maybe have to go through different things where we start to recognize that what we hear in history actually happened to real individuals.
Right. It's true. I mean, we had almost no pictures of them, right? Because the pictures were all destroyed. The only pictures that we had of them were pictures from the German ID cards that they got, and a few pictures that my father had sent to his family in the United States. He had cousins who had escaped from Poland after the pogroms in the 1920s. So those were the people who helped us get to the United States. When we were going through all these real places now where people, and that was important to go there, even if those places were different than they were when they were there. We find a picture of my mother's father. So this was in the archives, right? And we hadn't found it before. And we had a guy who had been helping us, who lived in Warsaw, an Israeli actually, but had moved his family because he could no longer afford living in Israel. And he said, I have to show you. And there was a picture of this man, and he was my grandfather. And I was named after him. That was amazing. The next day we go to an exhibit in Schindler's factory. So Oskar Schindler had this factory, and he saved the Jews, some 1,000 Jews or so. And there's an exhibit. And I'm walking through the exhibit, and there's a picture. And it's a picture of my grandfather that I met just the day before. Because for me, it was the day before that I met him. And here he was with other people it was supposed to be the ghetto. It was actually not it, but it was in the Jewish quarter. And I said to my father, isn't that Jacob Gold? Isn't that my grandfather? And my wife looked at it, she said, yeah, we just saw that. And everything just kept becoming so. It was there are 3 dimensions, and then there are many more than 3 dimensions. And this was a multi-dimensional experience of just seeing a person who you just saw as an ID. Now there were other people around him, and he was just one person. And he's not just on a list that you get of all the people who survived, or all the people who were killed, and all the people who were transported from one place to another to the death camps. It was a remarkable experience, and doing all of that over a few week period as we did. I mean, we find a woman who was my father's niece in Israel, and we meet her, and she happens to be working at Yad Vashem at the Holocaust Memorial there, and all of it was just so. There were so many facets. It's sort of like the smells, the tastes, everything suddenly happens in a way that that it's overwhelming, but extremely necessary. And even though it's a short visit, it was enough to really say, now I'm ready to write this story, even though there are many, many holes in the story. There are many assumptions that I make because they are unknowable.
And they're probably never
No,
knowable,
never,
because
no,
there are too many records that weren't kept. There were too many
right,
records that didn't
yeah,
survive.
right,
And you just have to kind of make an assumption based on what we know
right,
generally.
right.
This is most likely. Yeah.
Right. And again, my parents wrote their story in their own heads. I mean, they decided this was the story that I want because this is the story I can live with.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I did the same thing. This is the story that I have come to believe and understand. And now I know them better than I ever thought I would. And then I know myself better than I ever
Never
thought I
thought.
would.
I'd be curious to sit down and talk with your sons and ask them, do you feel like you know yourselves better now?
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
we've
I mean,
not had that conversation, but I could point out to them where, but it's up to them really to discover
exactly,
for themselves.
exactly. I would just think, now that you've learned many things about yourself, I'm sure
Right,
that you've done some introspection and looked back and said, well, what did all of this mean for the way I fathered?
right,
And
right, exactly.
for the way I husband,
Yeah.
and for the way I don't remember what you do for a living. Well,
I actually am a writer.
okay. Okay. So I mean, so as a writer,
Yeah.
like
Well,
how did all of this, I'm sure you've sat down and said, wow, I
yeah,
can see where this touched me, or how this moved me in this direction, or
yeah.
how this made me believe certain things, or do certain things, or act certain ways. And then doing that, of course, means that your boys were raised a certain way, which means that they're raising their children with
Certainly.
certain belief systems. These are the kinds of things I find so fascinating about history. People, like I said, they block it into this little thing. This is when this happened. And it's, yes, that's when it happened, but that is not when it ended.
Right. Exactly.
And it can be generations and generations and generations
Right.
in
Right.
which it still kind of manifests itself,
Right.
whether it's an actual genetic imprint, or whether it's just because of the environment and what you learned. I find that very fascinating. It's a
Yeah,
very,
and
very,
it's sort of nature versus nurture,
exactly.
sort of writ large, but at the same time, it's up to it truly is up to each of us, whether our stories are to understand that. And
Right.
you can't be taught that or told, well, that's why you're so afraid, or that's why you're this, or that's why you're that, because it all of this is multidimensional. So
Exactly.
uh, and there are a lot of inputs. My inputs and my sister's inputs were the same in some ways,
And different in
and
others.
different in other ways. The
Right.
relationship I had with my father versus the relationship she had with her father, and the same thing with our mother. And we turned out to be similar in some ways, my
And
sister and I,
different in other. Yeah.
and different, and for lots of reasons. It's an instructive thing to try to figure some of this out,
Yeah.
and sometimes to sort of avoid figuring it out, because I think the story becomes too simple, and our stories are all much more
Right,
complicated.
right. You are the son of Holocaust survivors, and you are many other things too.
That's
And so
right.
you don't want to boil it down to that alone,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that alone doesn't tell your whole story.
Right, right.
Yeah.
On a fairly superficial though important level, you want that story to be told because this Holocaust thing and how that came to be, and why we see so much hate now in our own country, that needs to be understood and needs to be
Absolutely.
highlighted to people, that hate can do things that you never thought. And I think that's true for in Germany
It's true
and in
anywhere.
Poland, allowing hate to begin to manifest itself, and allowing it in ourselves can lead to things that we would never think we were capable of.
I think that's a good lesson, like you said, that we really understand that this isn't something that happened in Germany and
Mm.
Poland and
Mhm.
it did happen there, but it isn't a German thing. It's a human thing. It's
Mhm.
what happens when people become afraid. It's what happens when people have hatred. It's what happens when people put hatred and fear together, because as soon as you do that, then you start doing some pretty crazy things to be safe, but it isn't
Yeah,
good, you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
And I mean that what happened is it's incomprehensible to me. And yet it could happen again
Mhm, mhm.
if we're not careful. And so stories like this are imperative that people be reminded what actually happened
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what the ramifications are.
Right.
Yeah.
I was very lucky to have found this publisher, Amsterdam Publishers in Holland.
Hmm.
And the woman who started that publishing house had decided, I guess now it's over 10 years ago, that the stories were being forgotten.
Hmm.
And she was going to devote her publishing house to just telling those stories. We had a little get together at the Dutch consulate last year. And so a number of the authors were there. And we all looked at each other, and we all came from lots of different places, and we were lots of different ages. And we just said to each other, there were 40 of us in here, 40 out of millions of
And
stories that
millions.
haven't
Right.
been told. There's just so much more to know about that and about so many other similar kinds of things that have happened around the world that are just buried, that
Right.
are unknown, and no one has paid attention to it. I mean, we're fortunate that we have. It's incumbent upon the children of survivors and even the grandchildren of survivors to keep those stories alive in some way so that we don't make the same mistake again.
I agree. One thing that you said is that you found that many children of the Holocaust survivors, they kind of feel like their lives have to be good enough to make their parents' survival worthwhile. Like that everything that they went through, all that they did, that they have to be good enough. Do you feel that that happened to you? Did you have that? And do you feel like you passed that down at all? Like, do your sons or do your grandsons, do they feel like they too have to be something to have made the sacrifice that your parents made?
I think in some ways, yeah, I think they were driven in some ways to excel in high school. One of my sons was a valedictorian. They're twins. The other was a salutatorian. So they were number one and two, and they both went to Yale. One gets a Harvard MBA, the other one gets a Yale law degree, and without us pushing them in the least. But I think they saw their grandparents, and they knew their grandparents in a different way. They knew their
Mhm.
grandparents as people who loved them,
Right.
and that was it. It sort of unconditionally loved them. We were the parents who were trying to guide them,
Shape
perhaps.
them, right.
Yeah. And these were just two people sort of who came out of the blue, very simple. The relationship was just very simple and very deep. And I think that guided them into saying, well, why shouldn't I try for everything?
Right.
And, because these two just tried to live for another day. And I think a lot of that was unconscious or subconscious. And we certainly, we stayed away from even trying to guide them at all when it came academically at all. Other ways, maybe we did well or we didn't do well. Who knows?
Right.
But
Right.
but it's not just up to us. It's up to them. They have their own worlds that they have developed for
Exactly.
themselves. It's not our lives. And you learn that from my parents too. They were harmed in lots of ways, and they passed some of that on to us. And fortunately, they didn't pass a lot of that on to us as well. And that
Yeah.
right. I
Yeah.
mean, we're not basket cases. I mean, at least I don't think we are. I mean, there's no third party to judge us.
Right. Right.
In my book, I judge them in a certain way because I see them in a certain way. But and again, it was an evolving way. It allowed me to see them with a lot of distance, and at the same time, very become much closer to them as well.
Right.
As the title of the book could say, a painful joy.
So if a reader, especially someone who's non-Jewish, no real personal connection to the Holocaust, picks up Painful Joy, what do you want them to get from reading it?
I do want them to learn that these two people were just not another two anonymous people. I really think that my mother and father, too many people stayed away from them, in a sense, because of how poor we were, or how my mother was a crazy person, or whatever it was. And they deserved more. And I just want strangers who read this book to actually sort of begin to like them, and maybe even love them, and be sad when they die, and recognize them as people. I think that we lived, the four of us lived a very solitary life in many ways, for lots of reasons. And it would be nice, even though they're not around anymore, to see any of this. It just would make me feel good that people, two of my friends read the book, and they said, even though they knew a lot about them, because I had spoken about them a lot, but they got to know them in a way they never thought they would, and they couldn't put the book down. They had to read it in 2 sittings. They had to, it's
I
not
had,
easy, and
yeah,
it's not
no,
easy to do.
no, right.
Yeah.
That's good. That's what you wanted, because at least for me, having read it, I have thought about your parents so many times in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Just continually think about it. Different things that you said, it would just pop up out of, I'll be doing something and I'll think of your mother, or I'll think of your father, and I'll think, I wonder if I lived next door to your mother, if I would have been willing to listen.
Yeah.
Would I have sat, because I am a listener. I actually
Uh-huh.
enjoy hearing people's stories. And I wondered, like, would I have been able to listen, or would I have thought, oh, there comes that crazy lady. Let me get out of, the backyard real fast,
Right.
And again, it made me wonder. And there was the one story you told about your dad that I sent out a mass text to several people, and I said, I just read the saddest thing that I think I have ever read in my life. And it was when you came to visit. He already had Alzheimer's. He was very happy to see you. He said, all of a sudden he started to cry, and he said, I know I love you. I just don't remember why.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I started to sob. I
Hmm.
sent it to people. You're not going to
Hmm.
believe what I just read. Is this the
Yeah.
saddest thing ever? So you definitely succeeded in getting people to know and come to love and appreciate your parents.
Yeah. I mean, if that's what it is, then that would be great. If in addition to that, people started look at other strangers and say, maybe I should pay, I shouldn't walk away right away. Even though,
Yeah.
like a homeless person, like you sort of say, oh my God, a
Yeah.
homeless person, get me out of here. But just
But they have
even if,
stories
yeah, even if you don't do anything, at least look at them as a
as a
person,
human.
that
Right.
they have a lot to say if they wanted to, and could say it the right way, and if anybody would listen. I still feel a little bit guilty sometimes, because I would talk to my mother, and I remember I would be driving. I had a job, and I would go to Princeton, in Princeton, New Jersey, and I would go back and forth. And I had one of the early cell phones, right? And it was in the car, because my boss decided I had to be available at all times, day or night,
Mhm.
even back then in the 90s. And I would call my mother as I'm driving back and forth. And my mother would sort of get the hint that maybe I'm not listening to anything she's saying, because this was a 2-hour drive. So she was
Right.
talking to me for 2 hours. And, and every once in a while she would say, "Are you listening to me?" And I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, I'm listening to you. I'm
Yeah.
listening to
And
you."
you,
I really was not
yep.
listening to her. I
Yeah.
was first, was in the New Jersey Turnpike, so just trying to pay attention. But and there's a part of me that says, maybe if I had listened something, I might have actually learned something, instead of sort of turning her off because it's enough already. I remember my sister and I, when we were very young, we both almost at the same time told her that we hated her. And
Oh,
this is when we were still living in Coney Island. So, I was maybe in 3rd grade and my sister was maybe in 5th grade or something like that. But we just decided that we couldn't take it anymore. So we both, and my mother went crazy, that we said the word hate to her. Uh, but and then you sort of come back to it and you say, what were we hating her about? What terrible thing did she do to us besides what she always did to us? I mean, why that day? And why did she have such a visceral reaction? She was going to tell my father when he got home, but my father didn't really pay attention either. You wonder, but I think that's true of every young person.
Oh,
And
yeah.
particularly once they've lost their parents and they say, I should have done this.
I should have. But,
Yeah.
I always remind people we usually do the best we can do. If we
Yeah.
could have done better, we would
Yeah.
have.
And that's,
It's true of your parents. It's
yeah.
true of you.
Yeah,
You
these aren't malevolent people. I mean, these are
right.
people who are just trying to make it another day, another
Exactly.
dollar, or whatever it is.
Exactly.
The cover of the book has the two of them on a motorcycle.
Yes.
I think it was an intentional. First of all, we had very few pictures, so there weren't that much to pick. But to find that picture, which was so atypical in so many ways for these two survivors, this picture was taken. They had been out of the camps for what, 8 months, maybe,
Yeah.
out of Bergen-Belsen. My mother was there when Anne Frank was there
Right.
and died of typhus with her sister. I mean, Bergen-Belsen was like the worst possible place to, it's sort of like it was a punctuation point. You thought it was bad in all the other. In
Yeah.
Auschwitz, well, wait until you
Wait
get
till
to
you see this
Bergen-Belsen.
one. Right.
This one, that was built for 7,000 people, and there were 60,000 people there, and there were thousands of bodies just sitting everywhere in big mounds because there was nowhere to put
Nowhere
them
to
in.
put them.
And this was where my mother spent the last, I would say, 6 months of her Holocaust career. My father spent less, but he had survived a death march to get to this lovely
Right.
place. It so boggles the mind that
And then 8 months after
yeah, and
that,
after
they're
that,
on a
they're on this
motorcycle.
motorcycle, sort of dressed to the nines with whatever clothes they got from some Swedish charity that allowed them to have that, and then a few months later they get married, and sure, not that long after that, my sister is born, and
Right.
it's so extraordinary that having that on the cover, I think, is trying to tell people, you think you'll know who these people are, where they came from, and you don't begin to
You're
know.
not even going to begin to know.
And that's true for all of us every time we walk by another human being.
I agree. What are your future plans, Max? What are you up to?
I don't know. I don't know. I just don't know.
You don't know. Well,
I truly don't know.
That's an acceptable answer.
Yeah. My one of my sons has been living in China with our grandchildren for the last 13 years, and he just moved back to the States 2 weeks ago. So we have a whole new chapter of our lives.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. That
And
does sound
our
wonderful.
other son is with us now, and our grandson lived with us for the last year. So you just never know, and that's a
No,
good
you
thing.
don't. So how could readers get in touch with you?
I was very proud of myself that I created my own website all by myself because I ran out of money. But so if you go to www.maxfriedman, one word, FRIEDMAN, Max, but one word, .net, you'll find my website. And on the website, you actually will see other pictures that we found, sort of more about why this story, some excerpts from things. And there are lots of places where you can send me a note and I can try to answer. And also where you can get the book, I mean, which is mostly on Amazon, is the easiest place.
Right.
In all of its various forms. I'd love to hear from people. I've heard from some people, and some people who I had lost touch with for 50 or 60 years, who I've heard from, which is very pleasant, because I hope it spurs people to ask questions. And I hope if I can't answer them, I can at least maybe point you in directions.
I want to thank you so much for not only writing this book, for being here on Online for Authors. I have so enjoyed talking with you.
Well, it's very nice. I mean, when I first started talking about the book, I was very, very nervous. And then I started to say, it's not fun, but it's important. And I talk even more than I should about a lot of things. I mean, I just go on and on and on and on, maybe because I'm an older man and I don't have anyone working for me who is willing to listen because they're being paid to listen.
They're being paid to.
Yeah,
Or maybe
so,
you have just a little tiny bit of your mother in you, and you're kind of
well,
like taking us
I'm
by the
sure
face and saying,
yeah, I'm
"Listen
sure.
to
Yeah,
me."
I mean, the only thing I can tell people is I won't have a serrated knife in my hand as my
That's
mother
good.
did,
That's good.
and I won't grab your arm, or at least
Okay.
only affectionately.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Well, thank you so much, Max. I really have
Yeah.
enjoyed getting to
Well,
know you.
thank you, and I appreciate the time, and I appreciate all your insights.
Thank you, Visibility Pod, for all your services and management of our podcast.